How about you? You've been quite busy.
Yeah, found myself more busy during this time than I was before.
Yeah, I hear that.
It's just non-stop.
Mm.
Non-stop reading. This should really be coming through. Something's not happening on. Give me a moment, Jody. I'll just try and see.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, so they're just sorting out what was happening. So we're live now. Good evening, everyone. We'd like to say hello. The Nottingham Conference Youth Department. We are looking forward to tonight's presentation. Tonight we're talking about archaeology and the David debate. Our study tonight is going to be led out by Jodie Bloom, who I'm really looking forward to hearing what she's got to say this evening. Jodie, you've always had, how could I say, a love for archaeology or those ancient things. Could you say, like, where did it all come from?
That's a good question. I think, to be honest, I just remember growing up as a child and watching these documentaries about archaeology and just being fascinated. There was one in particular called Time Team, where they had to excavate sites in just 3 days. And I remember growing up and just watching that, all the time. And I think my mum got a little bit fed up because she wanted to watch other programs. But I just found it fascinating to know how people can build up a picture of what happened in the past through digging. So I think that's what got me into it.
So, I mean, tonight you're talking about the David debate. I remember when I saw the title and I was like, what is there to debate about David? We read him this King of Israel, the root and Jesus came through his line. What's there to debate about him? So I think tonight's topic is going to be really interesting for everybody who's watching online. What we'll do, we'll open with a word of prayer. We'll talk a bit more about what you've been doing, Jodie, and tonight's presentation. And then we'll see what we can learn of this debate regarding David from an archaeological perspective. So let's open with a word of prayer and then we'll talk a bit more.
Okay.
Dear Lord, we thank you so much for the privilege as we're leading up to your holy day, the Sabbath day. And as we've got this opportunity, before those holy hours begin, we're in a Bible study moment. We're in a time where we're going to hear from Jodie, your daughter, regarding those findings, those archaeological finds that have been made, that have been excavated, that have given proof to a Bible story, a Bible narrative. And as we delve into this study tonight, I pray that it will seek to encourage people who are watching online, those who may be questioning about archaeology, that it will answer some questions that they may have even regarding this. So I pray that you will speak clearly through both myself and Jodie this evening. In Jesus' precious name, we say amen.
Amen.
So Jodie, look, just before we begin, you did a master's in Assyriology.
Yeah.
Sometimes I look at it, when I'm looking at it, Assyriology, there's times you think, I need to make sure I say this properly. It's the study of ancient Mesopotamia.
Mm-hmm.
And you also work as an archivist in an archaeology company in Oxford. Can you tell us a bit about that journey from, how did you get there? The master's, the job. Could you tell us a bit about that journey?
Okay, so I think it actually started when I was thinking about what to study at university. I had a few different ideas, and archaeology was one of them. I wasn't exactly sure, but I decided to go on an excavation in the summer holidays. It was 2 weeks, and I absolutely loved it. And it convinced me that actually, yes, this is something I want to study at university. So I did my undergraduate course in Archaeology of Ancient Civilizations. And so the course looked at Egypt, Greece, Rome, and the ancient Near East. And then in the second and third year, you had to specialize a bit more. So I specialized in Egypt and the ancient Near East. And I just, the more I learned about these civilizations, the more I wanted to know. And I really, in particular, liked my Near Eastern modules, learning about Assyria and Babylon and Israel. And so that really encouraged me to pursue it further and to do a master's. And I'm so glad I did. I learned a lot about it. And some people do archaeology and then they don't go into the profession. Some do. But for me, I wanted to make sure I did something related to archaeology. And so I found the company I work with now, and I started off as an archaeologist, working in the field, digging 8 till 4, and then recently I've got a new role, so it's in the office. It's looking at the documents and the reports and everything that the archaeologists produce and the specialists produce. And so basically we collect it, we organize it, and we get it ready to be deposited with museums. So yeah, that's what I'm currently doing.
You know, there's been times when like I'm preparing presentations and then we're talking about Babylon and the Medes and the Persians and then Greece. And you studied the things that the preachers, the evangelists, they just love to present on and talk about those prophetic messages that we find in the Bible. And I'm guessing it's like a dream to be able to, I don't know, get down on your knees and actually find something. What would you say has been your most interesting find to date? And I'll say to date because I'm guessing there'll be more.
Oh gosh, it's hard. I mean, the one that came into my mind immediately, like I said, most of my work, or a lot of my work, has been based in the UK. So the one that came into my mind was a site I was on which had medieval occupation. It was actually a site of a medieval windmill. And I found a medieval key. And the funny thing is, at first when I saw it, I thought it was just a nail, because we'd been finding lots of nails around. So I saw something sticking up and I was like, okay, it's a nail. And I carried on digging and I pulled it out and it had a square end. And I was like, this is not a nail. And I realized it was a key. So that's pretty cool. I've also excavated some, I think it was either Iron Age or Roman pottery, but it was intact. And usually you don't find pottery intact, you find it in pieces. So it's always very exciting when you find something which isn't broken. So that was really fun to excavate that and to lift it out in one piece.
Is there like this passion? You found the key, but you didn't find the door. You didn't find the box. Is there, or the padlock, or whatever it may have been for? Is there that element within archaeology where you find something and then it just encourages you to want to look for where is this from? What else can I find with this?
Definitely, 100%. Once you find one thing, you're like, right, you're digging twice as fast.
It's amazing. So today you're talking about the David debate from this archaeological perspective. What can we expect to find out? I mean, you're going to be going through it, but what could you say would really stand out for somebody just as that beginning point before you actually start the presentation?
I mean, I don't want to give too much away. I think just knowing the challenges that have been raised in archaeology recently, how it relates to things which actually we might take for granted as we read the Bible, and seeing how archaeology can provide answers, I think.
Wow, fantastic. Well, for all of you who are online, while you're watching, if you do have questions or thoughts that you'd like to share, please do. Just put a comment either if you're watching on Facebook or if you're watching on YouTube, and we'll do our best, if possible, to answer some of those questions or make mention of some of the thoughts and opinions that you may have. But without further ado, Jody, I'll hand over to you. You'll be going through a presentation with us, and then we'll have some questions afterwards as well. It's over to you.
Great. Okay. So can you see that? Yep, is that working?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, great. So good evening, everyone. I'm very excited to be able to share the topic with you tonight. But before we jump straight into it, it's probably best to start off with the question, what is archaeology? The Society for American Archaeology puts it this way. Archaeology is the study of the ancient and recent human past through material remains. Now, the phrase material remains just means things like buildings, burials, food, pottery, tools, and any other objects or artifacts that might be left over from previous societies. So as archaeologists, we dig, we excavate sites, and we study the material remains in order to build up a picture of what happened in the past. It's important to mention, though, that what archaeologists do not do is dig dinosaurs. Just so you know, that's paleontology. And there are two things I think are necessary for you to know about archaeology. Firstly, the excavations we carry out in our research are irreversible and essentially destructive. And for archaeologists, that's very important for us to remember, because we're excavating an area, we're removing the soil that lies beneath. And once you do that, the context of the object or the feature is destroyed, which means if a site has already been excavated, you can't go back 5 years later and re-excavate the same area. It's already been done, the process is irreversible. And that's why it's crucial that we make records of everything we dig and we preserve the artifacts, because that's what's going to survive in future. And secondly, archaeology relies on interpretation. And this is something that right at the start of my first year of university, I remember my lecturers were hammering into us. You know, we weren't there, we didn't physically see what happened. So we have to rely on what evidence we have to interpret an artifact or a site. And sometimes interpretations change, and as we continue to excavate, our knowledge and our understanding grows. And sometimes previous theories end up being altered or dismissed altogether. So the more evidence we have, the more confident we can be about our conclusions. And I think that's important to remember, because people often say that archaeology proves the Bible. And personally, I'm hesitant to use the word prove just because it suggests you have 100% of the evidence and there's no room for doubt or differences in opinion. But in the book Great Controversy, the writer Ellen White makes a really interesting point. She says, while God has given ample evidence for faith, he will never remove all excuse for unbelief. All who look for hooks to hang their doubts upon will find them. And those who refuse to accept and obey God's word until every objection has been removed and there is no longer an opportunity for doubt will never come to the light. So because of the nature of archaeology, there's always going to be room for unbelief. But notice again what she says in the first line. She says, God has given us ample evidence for faith. And that's what archaeology does as well. While it can't prove without a shadow of a doubt that the Bible is inspired by God, I do believe it gives us ample evidence to demonstrate the validity and the trustworthiness of Scripture. So let's move on to tonight's topic. Archaeology and the David Debate. Now, in recent years, society has grown increasingly secular. And as it has, there's also been an increase in criticism of the biblical text. And a number of scholars of archaeology have put forward theories and ideas which undermine the accuracy of the biblical accounts. So, for example, one argument that was prevalent for a long time stated that David wasn't a historical figure. And the reason many scholars came to this conclusion was because there was no evidence for David outside of the Bible. None of the Egyptian or Assyrian documents we had mentioned him. He was only mentioned in Scripture. And so it was concluded that David was just a literary creation made up by individuals much later in time. Those advocating that idea were often termed minimalists. They were and are still very skeptical of the biblical text, and especially the idea that it contains a real historical memory. So they tend to only base their conclusions on extra biblical sources. An example of this came in 1992 with the release of a book entitled In Search of Ancient Israel by a man named Philip R. Davis. So Davis was a biblical scholar at the University of Sheffield. And you might have noticed that the title in his book, Ancient Israel, has quotation marks around it. And this is because Davis is arguing that the Israel depicted in the Bible was basically a fairy tale. And in his book, he makes this statement: "The biblical empire of David and Solomon has not the faintest echo in the archaeological record as yet." Now, this is a very significant claim because David is central to the biblical text. He's mentioned over 900 times in scripture. Many of the Psalms were written by him. And of course, it's through his line that the Messiah comes. So if you took him out, you'd end up with a very different kind of Bible. But notice in Davis's quote, the last two words of his sentence, "as yet." The argument he's making is an argument from silence. He's saying, we haven't found any evidence yet, so therefore David and his kingdom didn't really exist. But the danger of making arguments from silence is that there's always the possibility that future excavations might reveal some evidence. You may know that well-known phrase which says, "The absence of evidence is not evidence for absence." And a year after this book came out, there was a discovery made at the ancient city of Tel Dan in northern Israel. While archaeologists were excavating, they uncovered a stela, which is a block of stone inscribed with writing. This stela is now known as the Tel Dan inscription. The inscription was written in a language called Aramaic. The text describes a battle at the hands of Hazael of Damascus and the defeat of the king of Israel and the king of the house of David. It's interesting that the phrase House of David is used because that's the same terminology we find throughout the Bible. So this inscription was an extremely important find. It was extra biblical evidence that demonstrated there was a kingdom of David, that David was a historical figure. But not everyone was satisfied, and some of the minimalist scholars argued that it was a forgery. Others said that it had been misread or misinterpreted. But these criticisms didn't carry much weight, and today the historicity of King David isn't disputed among scholars. But now the debate in scholarship has shifted, and this time the argument focuses on chronology and the nature of the kingdoms of Israel and Judah. You see, the Bible describes a united monarchy. It was started by King Saul, and then during King David and Solomon's reign, the kingdom expands and becomes more powerful. After Solomon, the nation splits, and you get Israel in the north and Judah in the south. The minimalist scholars argue that there was no united monarchy. While they accept that David was a real figure, they maintain that the Bible dramatically exaggerates the nature of his kingdom, that Judah wasn't as extensive as the Bible records, that it was limited to Jerusalem and the immediate area surrounding it. They argue that actually the kingdom of Israel in the north developed first in the 9th century, and it was only after that, in the 8th century, that Judah actually developed into a kingdom. These ideas were largely influenced by a professor called Israel Finkelstein. He's written a number of different books with his colleagues, and these are the arguments they present. The Kingdom of Judah was a sparsely populated hinterland, so basically not very extensive and quite rural. There's no evidence for major buildings or fortifications. They argue that Jerusalem was just a small village, and also that there's no evidence for extensive literacy. So these are some pretty serious challenges that have been raised recently. Notice, though, that like before, these are also arguments from silence. Now, if you wanted to search for answers about the nature of the Kingdom of Israel during the reign of David, you might think that Jerusalem would be an obvious place to investigate. After all, according to the Bible, Jerusalem was the capital that David set up. But Jerusalem can be a difficult city to excavate, partly because the modern city is actually built on top of much of the ancient city, which means archaeological excavations are often limited to small areas. Despite that, there have been a number of excavations carried out at Jerusalem. One in particular was carried out by an archaeologist called Elliot Mazar, and in 2005, they uncovered a substantial stone structure which seems to date to the beginning of the 10th century BC, which is the time of David. Elliot Mazar, along with many other scholars, believe that this substantial stone building was a palace. And since it seems to date to the 10th century BC, they identify this as the Palace of David. Now, there have been many debates on both sides over that interpretation, but since then, another site in Israel has been excavated, and that site has proved to be very important in this debate. The name of that site is Khirbet Qeiyafa. Now, Khirbet Qeiyafa is located here in the Elah Valley, and in ancient times it was situated basically on the border of Judah and Philistia, along a main road that leads to Jerusalem. So how was the site discovered? Well, in 2003, a man by the name of Sar Ganor visited the area. He was working with the Israel authorities to prevent the looting of ancient sites, so he examined the area, and as he did so, he began to suspect that the ruins might be very important. A couple of years later, he shared his thoughts with an archaeologist called Yosef Garfinkel, and they decided to go out and have another look. So after taking a road trip to Khirbet Qeiyafa, they agreed to organize a trial excavation, just 2 weeks, to see what was there. After the 2-week dig, they realized the site had an impressive occupation layer which dated to the biblical Iron Age period. So all their initial doubts disappeared, and they started planning a full excavation. Now, Yosef Garfinkel, who's a professor of the Hebrew University, decided to partner with another institution. So he approached Michael Hazel of Southern Adventist University, and excavations began. Here's an aerial photograph of the excavations at Khirbet Qeiyafa. And when you examine this site, you begin to realize that this is not just a small village. This is a fortified city. Here's a plan of Khirbet Qeiyafa. The areas highlighted in grey are the areas that were excavated. And if you look at the walls that surround the city, you can see that they're casemate walls. Now I know what you're thinking. What on earth is a casemate wall? Well, a casemate wall is basically 2 parallel walls with a short horizontal wall in between, which creates a kind of chamber. You can see it a bit more clearly in the photograph. You have the city gate just at the top, and here's the casemate wall. 2 parallel walls with a short vertical wall in between, creating a chamber. And these chambers were really useful because in times of peace, they could be used as storage rooms. But if the city was in danger of being attacked, they would quickly fill the chamber with dirt and stones to create a much thicker, more solid defensive wall. Now, as they excavated the walls, the archaeologists also discovered that the wall was built directly onto bedrock, onto solid rock. And this would have been useful for a couple of reasons. Firstly, it would give more stability in the event of an earthquake, which occurred a fair amount in Israel. But secondly, it was actually a very good defensive strategy. You see, one method of conquering an ancient city was to tunnel underneath the outer wall to try and get inside, or at least to undermine the wall so that it would eventually collapse. But if you're building directly onto bedrock, it's virtually impossible to tunnel underneath. So building onto bedrock actually improves a city's defense. Now, if you take another look at the plan of the site, you see another feature of the city's architecture is that they have houses built directly up against the walls. Also, when you look at the entrances to these chambers, you see that they are consistently positioned in the furthest corner away from the city gate. So let's look at another photograph. You can see on the left of the gate, the entrances to these chambers are on the left, but on the right of the gate, the entrances are on the right. So this is all very interesting, but why is it important? Well, it demonstrates that this city didn't develop randomly. There must have been some kind of central organization or administration that was intentionally planning the city. And you would also need some sort of central organization to oversee the construction of the city and to organize all the resources needed to build it. And considering that there were a few thousand tons of stone being used to build this site, the task would have been pretty significant. Now, the type of construction used at Khirbet Qeiyafa is actually seen elsewhere in Israel, specifically at Judean sites. But what's significant about Khirbet Qeiyafa is it's actually the earliest evidence we have of urban planning using these features. So, we have a fortified site in Judah, which seems to have been constructed after careful planning by some kind of central administration. But how do we know when it dates from? Well, during these excavations, they found a lot of these pottery fragments. Now, there are a few different ways you could date a site. There's what we call stratigraphy, or there's carbon-14 dating, and a few other different methods. But pottery is actually the most common method used because it's found all the time. And it's not really possible to reuse pottery. So once it's broken, people just throw it away. Now, different cultures made different styles of pot. So their size, their shape, their decoration would often be pretty distinct. And these pottery styles would change fairly rapidly. And that enables us to work out the date of a site based on what type of pottery is found. So it's a little bit like cars. Cars have changed over time as well. And if you've got someone who's an expert at makes and models of cars, they'd be able to look at a car and tell you that's the 1980s Ford Fiesta. And it's the same kind of thing with pottery. An expert in ceramics could look at a piece of pottery and tell you that's Philistine ware, or that's from an Egyptian pot and it dates to the Iron Age, or it dates to the Bronze Age. So they found lots of these pottery fragments. And at the end of the excavation, after all the fragments had been washed, they carefully laid them out on the laboratory of the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. And they invited a number of different scholars to examine them. Now, sometimes there can be challenges with dating from pottery. And one of the challenges occurs when there are periods in history where the changes in style and decoration might happen more gradually than at other times. And in those cases, it can be slightly more difficult to pinpoint a specific date. And this is actually the case for the 9th, 10th century BC. So the scholars examined the pottery and they were divided. Some of them dated the pottery to the 9th century BC, and others dated the pottery to the 10th century BC. Now, in the 2008 season, they discovered carbonized olive pits in the city wall and in some of the buildings. And so since the specialists weren't completely agreed on the pottery dates, they decided to send the olive pits off for carbon dating at the University of Oxford. If the results came back dating the olive pits to the end of the 11th or the beginning of the 10th century BC, that would support the biblical tradition. But if it was later in the 9th century BC, it wouldn't fit with the biblical chronology. So it was a fairly tense moment for the directors when they packed the samples off to be sent to the University of Oxford. In fact, they were so tense that they inadvertently sent their credit card off with it. But thankfully, the credit card was returned to them, and so were the results. When the results came back, they showed that the average date given for the samples were from the early 10th century, supporting the biblical tradition. So now we have a fortified site in Judah, which has been carefully planned by some kind of administration, and it dates to the early 10th century BC, the time of King David. But again, the minimalist scholars were not satisfied, and so the argument shifted slightly. They started questioning the identity of the inhabitants of Kibbutz Kaiafa. How can we be so sure that this was an Israelite site? Maybe it was actually a Philistine or even a Canaanite site. Now, we actually get a clue about this from the Bible, specifically from 1 Samuel chapter 17. This is the chapter which describes the famous battle between David and Goliath, and verse 1 sets the scene. It says, "Now the Philistines gathered their armies together to battle, and were gathered at Socho, which belongs to Judah. They encamped between Socho and Azekah in Ephes Dammim." Now, the Bible is very specific in terms of the location of the Philistine armies. It specifically mentions these two cities, Socho and Azekah. And what's interesting is we know exactly where these places are. If we look at a map, here's Azekah, and here's Socho, and here's our site, Kibbutz Kaiafa. So let's look at a photograph. On the left hill is where Kibbutz Kaiafa is located. At the front right, we have Azekah, and in the back, we have Socho. So now, just imagine what it would have looked like to have seen thousands of Philistines camping between Azekah and Socho, the Israelites on one side, the Philistines on the other, and the valley of Elah in between. So our site is actually in the same location that the battle of David and Goliath took place. So I'm sure we all know the story of David and Goliath. The Bible records how David defeats the enemy, how he then cuts off his head, and when the Philistine army sees their champion lying dead on the ground, they start running. So the story continues in verse 52 of 1 Samuel chapter 17. Now the men of Israel and Judah arose and shouted and pursued the Philistines as far as the entrance of the valley and to the gates of Ekron. And the wounded of the Philistines fell along the road to Sharaim, even as far as Gath and Ekron. So the Israelites pursue the Philistines along the entrance of the valley of Elah. They're running back to their cities, Gath and Ekron, but many of them fell along the road to a city called Sharaim. So let's go back to the map. Here's Gath at the bottom, here's Ekron at the top, and again you see Kirbut Kaiafa, which was located along a main road that led to Jerusalem. So the location of our site, Kirbut Kaiafa, actually matches the location of the city Sharaim mentioned in the Bible. Also, the name Sharaim is interesting. It has a dual ending in Hebrew, and so the literal meaning of the name is 2 gates. Now, in the 2009 excavation at Kirbut Kaiafa, a second gate was discovered at the city. This is significant because it's extremely rare for a city to have more than one gate because it's the weakest point. So if you're getting attacked, you really don't want to have to defend several different areas. Now, you did sometimes get larger cities that had several gates, but with the smaller cities, it's rare to have more than one. And so both the location and the name suggest that Kirbut Kaiafa is actually the city of Sharaim mentioned in the Bible. It's also worth mentioning that the architecture, which we talked about earlier, the casemate walls that were built up against the houses, that's completely different to Philistine and Canaanite architecture. You don't get that kind of city planning at those sites. But you do find the same type of design at later Judean sites, such as Beth Shemesh and Beersheba. Now, as the team continued excavating, they also uncovered a lot of animal bones, and they were able to study these to see what types of animals would have been consumed at the site. They discovered that most of the animal remains were of sheep and goats and some cattle. But interestingly enough, after 7 seasons of excavating at the site, the team didn't find a single pig bone. Now, if you contrast that to Philistine sites like Gath and Ekron, which have also been excavated, they have around 15 to 30% pig bones. And pig bones are also found at some late Bronze Age Canaanite sites as well. So other areas were incorporating pig into their diet, but the inhabitants of this city were not. And this clearly is reminiscent of the dietary laws found in Leviticus. Leviticus 11, verses 7 to 8 says, "And the pig, though it has a divided hoof, does not chew the cud. It is unclean for you. You must not eat their meat or touch their carcasses. They are unclean for you." And when we excavate later Judean sites, there's also a significant lack of pig bone among the excavated animal remains. Although at the Judean site of Beth Shemesh, they did discover 0.0012% pig bone. So clearly some Israelite was indulging a little in their pork. But generally speaking, in Judean sites, we don't find pig remains in the animal records. Now, I mentioned earlier that a lot of pottery was discovered at the site, and among the different types were these. These clay, shallow bowls are actually ancient baking trays. They were placed on the fire and bread would be baked on top, and they were discovered in nearly every house at Kirbut Kaiafa. Interestingly, these baking trays are also not found at Philistine sites, again indicating that the inhabitants of this city weren't Philistine. Now, if you remember, one of the arguments put forward by the minimalist scholars was that there was no evidence for extensive writing. Well, as the team continued excavating, they found a fragment of pottery with writing on it, which we call an ostracon. Sometimes the writing on an ostracon is inscribed into the clay. Sometimes it's just written on a surface in ink. This one you can see has been written with ink. And this small fragment of pottery had Hebrew writing on it. You can see a clearer representation of it here. And this letter here is the Hebrew letter Aleph, which is where we get our letter A from. It was initially written upside down like this, because it actually came from a pictogram of an ox's head. So at the bottom, you have the head, and then the two lines on top are the horns. And over time, it became more stylized. You have it here as well on its side. And the reason why you see it in all these different positions is because this is a very early form of Hebrew writing, and it hasn't actually been standardized yet. So later on, it would become standardized and would be written like our letter A. But at this point in time, it could be written in different positions. And this ostracon is currently the oldest Hebrew inscription that we've actually ever found. So it's a pretty significant object. In the 2012 season, a second inscription was found. This time it was on a jar, and it was found in one of the rooms at the site. This inscription actually contained the name Eshbal, which, if you remember, was one of the name of Saul's sons. Now, this isn't the same individual because the inscription says it was someone else's son. But the interesting thing is that so far, we only have evidence of this name from the Bible, and all of the occurrences come from the 10th century BC and are mostly connected with King David's reign. So these two inscriptions provide amazing evidence of literacy. And bear in mind that this was found outside of Jerusalem, because we probably wouldn't be too surprised to find writing at the capital city. But this is outside of Jerusalem on the border of Judah and Philistia, which suggests that writing and literacy was widespread. And so if we look at what the site has shown us, we've got a fortified city located in Judah. We have evidence of city planning and central administration. It was occupied during the 10th century BC, which is around the time of King David. The location and the presence of the two gates match the biblical city, Sharayim, which we saw mentioned in the account of David and Goliath. The architecture, the ceramics, and the diet are very distinct from Philistine and Canaanite sites. And there is evidence of widespread writing. These findings have seriously challenged the arguments that had been brought forth questioning the nature of the Kingdom of Judah and the existence of a united monarchy in the early 10th century BC. And I think it's incredibly exciting to see all the new discoveries that are being made in the field of archaeology. It reminds me of a story in the book of Luke when Jesus is riding on a donkey into Jerusalem, and the people were crying out and praising God. And the Pharisees called to Jesus and said, "Teacher, rebuke your disciples." And Jesus answered them and said, "I tell you that if these should keep silent, the stones would immediately cry out." And through archaeology, we are learning and discovering so much more about the Bible and the people, places, and events it describes. So, thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Jody, for that presentation. In the words of somebody who's commented on the screen, they said, wow. I don't mean the W-O-W. This is like W-O-O-W-W. It's amazing the detail that archaeologists go into to, I don't want to say the word prove, but to show evidence in regards to, I guess it could be a challenge, the challenge for the person who wants to look into more, but also the challenge of answering those arguments. I think it was, you know, that quote that you read at the beginning from Ellen White, where God, he doesn't remove all of those places for us to hang our doubts on. Do you think that sometimes that he allows those hooks that we can hang our doubts on to be an opportunity to reveal truth, to kind of answer that doubt?
I think so, actually. I'd never really thought about it in that way. I think as humans, we always want to know everything. We don't like doubt, but actually, I think it solidifies your faith more when you start to question, you know, something I don't quite understand, I've got this doubt, and then you find something which completely explains it. I think that does strengthen your faith.
Yeah, because I'm thinking, you know, that guy Philip R. Davis, he writes the book. Even the cover of the book is challenging the nation, and he, you know, I'm guessing that with him through this, and then a year or, you know, a short time afterwards, they find Kerbet Kayafa that challenges the very doubts that he was probably espousing. I just think it's amazing. Archaeology is a beautiful thing, but the detail, you know, to find the pig bones of the Judean site, 0.0012%, you're able to identify. There was that naughty person who was eating the pig bone, not the pig bone, eating the pig. The baking tray. Sorry, say that again.
Be careful because your sins will find you out.
Yeah. And if the people don't speak out, the stones, or we could say the bones, will speak out for God. The baking tray. The pottery with writing on it. You call it the OSTRACON. With the early Hebrew form of that writing. I just think that's amazing. Now, a question that I've got for you is, what are the cautions that you, as archaeologists, have to take into consideration when using the archaeological finds as extra biblical evidence in favor of a biblical narrative?
So I think going back to the point I made at the start about interpretation, I think as archaeologists, we need to make sure that we don't jump to conclusions straight away, and that we really weigh out all the evidence and the different possible interpretations first before we make a conclusion, so that we can work out what makes the most sense, you know, what is the most likely interpretation in this instance. So if we use Kerbet Kayafa as an example, if we just said we think this site is Judean because there are no pig bones, and that was it, that probably isn't the strongest argument. But it's the fact that when you combine it with the fact that it's got very distinct pottery and architecture, and the location matches biblical Sharim and so on, you've now got a much more strong argument for this being a Judean site. And you know, to be honest, I think as an archaeologist, you really want to make sure that you do have as strong an argument as possible, because the scholars will challenge it.
Wow. Okay. How have scholars responded to this evidence that's been found?
Yeah, so in general, generally I think these findings have been well received. Some of the minimalist proponents, I'm not sure, have accepted it yet. And I think sometimes it does take a while for old theories to be discarded. You know, even with the Tel Dan inscription, it took a while before people actually accepted that, yes, this does mention David. And especially, you know, if you've written a book which says one thing and then you find evidence that contradicts it, you probably aren't going to be that keen to accept the evidence. But I think amongst most scholars, I do think it has actually had an impact on their previous views of the early history of the Kingdom of Israel.
Okay, so, you know, you spoke about that there's a section where pottery was found. You've got those, the gates that were found. How much of the site was excavated?
So it's an interesting question, actually, because usually we tend to only excavate portions. And especially with the big sites, sometimes you only excavate like 1 or 2% of a site. But with Khirbet Qeiyafa, it's a slightly smaller site and it doesn't have lots of different occupation layers. It's mainly just got the Iron Age biblical period, and there's a little bit of Persian and Hellenistic on top. So they actually managed to excavate 25% of the site, which it's a lot for, you know, an archaeological excavation.
I mean, 25% is a lot. I'm trying to think, what would it be like if they could excavate 100% of that site?
I mean, that would be amazing. The trouble you do have sometimes with archaeology is the techniques and the technology improves over time. And so you kind of almost don't want to excavate all of it, because, you know, in future there might be techniques and technology which would be able to discover more than you currently have. So I think sometimes they, you know, they let it rest for a little bit so that future archaeologists can come in and investigate.
So, I mean, there may be some future archaeologists that are watching now. There's always opportunities in archaeology. Okay, okay. What advice would you give to somebody who may be even thinking, you know, I'd love to get involved in archaeology?
So I think, you know, as I said earlier, for me, when I was considering archaeology as a subject to study, I went on an excavation for a couple of weeks to see what it was like. And so anyone who's considering it, I would definitely recommend finding an excavation. Lots of like excavations will allow you to participate even if you don't have any prior experience. So find one that looks interesting, contact the director and ask if you can join. And then, yeah, just go dig for a few weeks, see what you think. And, you know, if you're convinced like I was, then go for it.
So let's say, you know, the person who wants to go on one of those finds, those excavation sites, is there a danger that sometimes you set so much of a high expectation that you get disappointed?
I mean, archaeology can be difficult. So don't think of it as Indiana Jones. It's not. You know, in Israel, we wake up at 4 in the morning to be on site at 5, so that we don't have to dig in the hottest period of the day. So, you know, it's early mornings, it's physically tiring. We're not there with paintbrushes all the time. It's proper digging. And so I think you need to be realistic. But if it's for you, I think you will love it, because I personally, it's really funny, I'm not a particularly active person at all. And I, you know, I don't often go to the gym. I shouldn't admit this in public, but so archaeology is like the kind of discipline which you wouldn't really imagine me liking. But, you know, I'm just so fascinated between what we can discover that, you know, I will put up with being outside in the cold in England, in the rain sometimes, because I'm just, you know, so excited about the potential that can be found. So yeah, just go for it.
It's the find that keeps you going, isn't it?
Yeah,
looking for that.
I mean, it's not even necessarily just the specific object. Sometimes it's just working out what happened on a site, just kind of building up a picture. It's a little bit like a detective novel in a way. You've got all these pieces of evidences, and you're building up a picture as to what happened in the past.
Amazing. Now you mentioned, you know, there was the whole carbon dating that was used. Is radiocarbon dating an accurate method of dating?
So, I mean, that's a very good question. A couple of people do ask me this actually. It might be worth actually me just explaining it a little bit first and how it works. So carbon-14 is naturally produced in the atmosphere. So all living things will absorb it when they're alive, plants, animals, humans. We're constantly absorbing carbon-14. And then the moment the organism dies, it stops absorbing it, and the carbon-14 inside the organism starts to break down at a specific constant rate until eventually it will disappear altogether. And so basically the idea of carbon dating is to measure the amount of radiocarbon found in an organic material, say for example, seeds or wood, and then we compare it to the amount of C14 in the atmosphere to kind of determine and work out when, when the animal died or when the tree was cut down, for example. So I think with carbon-14 dating, I think it's worth remembering that there are certain things that can affect the reading. Like there's one thing called the marine reservoir effect, I think it's called, where if you have samples from marine life or organisms that ate a lot of sea-based food, when you radiocarbon date them, they can produce slightly older readings. So sometimes you need to factor that in. You've also got to be very careful with your samples, and you've got to make sure that when you collect them, they're clean, and that they haven't been contaminated by different types of soils, because that could also affect the date. So there are different things that can affect the readings. Now, it's an interesting question because it has proved to be useful in many excavations. It seems to tie in fairly well with the ceramic dates. But recently there has been a bit of growing concern over the accuracy of it. Some studies suggest that maybe there's still slight variances, and in some instances it seems that the further back in time you go, the radiocarbon dates and the ceramic dates seem to diverge slightly. So I think up until 1200 BC or 1400 BC, the dates work fairly well with ceramics, but then they start to diverge slightly. So it's an ongoing question. Many scholars will swear by it. Other scholars are a bit more hesitant. I'm not a specialist myself, but I think it has proved useful, especially when it's used in conjunction with other dating methods like ceramics. But I think it might be the case that in future it might need to be refined a bit more. It's my personal opinion.
Wow. Thank you very much for that. Somebody asked a question, and I want to give you the opportunity to answer this one. So somebody online on Facebook, they asked, has working in archaeology helped you learn to deal better with doubt?
I think it has. I mean, in terms of the work I do for my job, it's not particularly related to biblical archaeology. So not so much with my work, but especially when I was studying, I did a module in biblical archaeology, and I was learning quite a lot about the minimalist arguments. And it does sometimes make you wonder and doubt, like, actually how accurate is the Bible. But it's amazing seeing all these new excavations that answer these questions so directly. And I think it's important to remember that even if you don't have an answer now, like you literally don't know what future excavations will, uncover. And so, yeah, I think it has helped me deal with doubt.
Mm. Another one that's just come through is, how long have you've studied and worked in archaeology altogether? They've asked a few more. Did you ever feel like it might not be for you? And if so, what helped you push through?
So I started my undergraduate course in 2003. No, I didn't. 2010 till 2013. It was a three-year course, and then I went on to do my master's, which was 1 year. Um, I After my master's, I didn't go straight into archaeology. I was working in a museum for a little while, and then I got an archaeology job um, later. So in terms of my work, I've been at my current job. This is my second archaeology job. I've been in this one for about, I think it's just over 3 years actually now. That's gone quite quickly. So in total, it's probably about 4 years, I'd say, in archaeology, um, working in it, and then another 4 years studying. So 8 years altogether. It's a long time.
Mm.
And
Yeah.
so what was the other part of the question?
The other part of the question was, did you ever feel like it might not be for you? And if you did, what helped you push through?
I never felt like it might not be for me. I think the struggle I had straight after university was just getting a job, because at the time they really wanted you to have experience working in the commercial sector, which is a type of archaeology I do. And I didn't have that much experience. So I think at the time it was more just a struggle, like getting my foot in. Um, but I knew that I wanted to do something related to archaeology because it was just a passion for me. So I think just persevering for me in terms of applying to lots of different places, and getting as much different experience as you can, because even though when I was working and volunteering, I did a lot of volunteering at museums as well. That wasn't directly excavating, but it was still experience which I could put in my CV. So yeah, definitely just getting as much experience as possible and just persevering, I think.
Mm, mm. Well, thank you. It's been mentioned a few times with the minimalist argument.
Mm.
Questions come through. Could you quickly explain the argument?
Okay, so I mean the arguments, there are a few variations, but the main one basically states that the kingdom of Israel isn't um, wasn't as the Bible depicted it. So there was no united monarchy, and the northern kingdom of Israel became a kingdom first in the 9th century, and then it was only after that that the kingdom of Judah became a kingdom in the 8th century. And basically, minimalist scholars tend not to view the Bible as a historical document. They think it was written much later. So they tend to base their conclusions on extra biblical sources. So the reason they thought that Israel developed first was because the first instance we have of Israel being mentioned in extra biblical sources were sources that talk about Ahab and Omri um, in the 9th century. And so that was the first time we see these kings really mentioned. And so they thought, okay, Israel came first, and then after that, Judah is mentioned, kings of Judah are mentioned in the 8th century. And so because we didn't have any earlier evidence of those Judean kings, that's why they assumed that it came later.
Thank you. As we're coming up towards the end, I remember years ago, you was in a discussion with somebody on Facebook, and I was talking about kings and the numbering, and you gave advice for the book to get. I haven't finished it, but when, when looking through the Book of Kings, it's always a good resource to have. That helps me, and I was even thinking about it the other day. I need to go back and look at that book when I'm about to go back and read Kings and Chronicles soon. I wanted to ask, what books, what resources are out there that could really help somebody who hasn't got the time to go and volunteer to be on that excavation site? What books are out there? What resources could you direct us to?
Okay. I'd actually forgotten that I'd recommended that book to you, by the way.
It's there. Don't ask me how far I got in it though.
So I'd say in terms of this excavation, there's a really good book that Joseph Garfinkel, Michael Hassel, and Sar Ganor wrote. It's this one, In the Footsteps of King David. That's really good. It's got a lot of information in, but it's also written for the public. So it's not too academic, but it's got a lot of the information in there. There's a good book by James Hoffermeyer about the archaeology in the Old Testament. Yeah, Archaeology of the Bible is what it's called, by James Hoffermeyer. And there's one about the archaeology in the Old Testament by Alfred, I don't know how to pronounce his surname, I think it's Hoerth. It's Hoerth. So that's quite good. That one's a bit more of a textbook, but he actually has, he writes a slightly condensed version as well. So that might be a good resource to use. So yeah, I think that those are some of the ones that I've used. Those are the ones that I think of top of my head.
Thank you very much. I think after Sabbath, I'll be looking on Amazon to see. I'll put them in my wish list, and I won't tell you when I get them. So I really hope that that's helped those of you who are out there who are asking, what are those resources? Can we use them? In closing, Jody, you've given an excellent presentation. I think it's really helped with understanding a bit more about the debate of the David debate, etc. In closing, how, and this is a question that's actually come in, how have you seen God work in your journey with archaeology, and how has it really confirmed your faith?
I think I've just, from the time I started my course, I think there have been so many more discoveries, and I think it's important that we shouldn't base our faith completely on archaeology, but it really has encouraged me that the Bible, the details that are mentioned in the Bible, which you gloss over and you don't think about, I feel like God put them there for a reason. I feel like he made sure the writers, included the location of Sha'arayim so that future people could, discover the site. There are so many details which in the Bible which you do gloss over, and then you find these archaeological discoveries which mention the most obscure person in a book, and you realize, God gave us this for a reason, and it does encourage our faith. Yeah, it has, over time, the more excavations I read about, the more I hear about, I'm just constantly encouraged by it all.
Yeah, thank you so much. I mean, just going off what you said, I was reading the other day in Matthew, Matthew chapter 2, chapter 1, and you're reading the story of Joseph with Mary and them having to go to these different places as they're walking around. But there was an argument that came up that I saw online where they're challenging the Bethlehem. And the place where they were from, saying that there was another site that would have been easier for Joseph to travel to because of the distance. But I thought, prophecy said that it would be in a certain place. So it's that place of prophecy. But for those of you out there that might want to be archaeologists, there's something for you to maybe go and look into. And I think it gives hope that when you're reading the Bible, those names, those places, those locations, they're given for a reason.
Mm.
And I wish you all the best with your work as an archaeologist and that great find that you all have as you continue looking. So for everybody online, we want to thank you so much for joining us this evening for another Friday night Bible study. Don't forget to join us tomorrow, 10:30 in the morning. We'll be starting the NECyouth Sabbath. We'll have Sabbath school, and then there'll be the divine service. And the preacher tomorrow will be Sebastian Braxton. So we're looking forward to the message there. And those of you that have been going through the End Bible study, get prepared for excellent study tomorrow again. Looking forward to the messages, the songs, and everything else. Have a happy Sabbath, and to everybody, good evening. Thanks again, Jody. Would you like to close with prayer for us?
Yeah, sure.
Thank you.
Dear Father in heaven, Lord, we're so thankful for the opportunity we have to come together to look into your word and to look into archaeology and to just be encouraged, Lord, about the historical accuracy and the things, Lord, that we're continually discovering, which just builds our faith. Dear Father, I pray, Lord, that we won't look at your word just intellectually, but that we will also apply it to our lives, that we will allow you to change us from the inside out, and that you'll use us to just be a witness to people around us, and that they may see our lives and know that you are real and that you are working. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen. God bless and have a happy Sabbath.
Happy Sabbath. Thank you.